And welcome to another episode of City Talk Live. I'm your host, Leonard J. Willett. Today I'm with an American economist from Washington, D.C. and his name is Richard Koffman. Richard, how are you doing today?
Very, very good.
What brings you to Manchester, New Hampshire?
Well, I came for the sun.
What happened to Florida? It was 23 degrees this
boring
morning.
going south, so I came north for the sun. I heard about the good weather, especially in Manchester.
Cold weather this morning, the 23 degrees.
Well, it's cold, but the sun is out. It's bright, you know.
That's right.
And I'm sure it's going to be a nice day.
And they say rain on Thursday. So let's talk about defense. Do you remember when the last time our government cut the defense budget by 30%? And why did they do that?
The last time that was done was when the Cold War hit. Basically, the late 80s and the early 1990s. When Bill Clinton was president, he began cutting back on defense spending. And through the 90s, the total reduction amounted to about 30%. Now, there had previously been another 30%. And that was long before the Cold War, when the Vietnam War ended. And when the Vietnam War ended, defense spending was cut back substantially by about 30%. At that time, under Lyndon Johnson, there had been statements made by the administration that when the Vietnam War ended, there would be a peace dividend. And that term was used to suggest that there would be so much money available that wasn't being spent for military purposes, that it could be used for non-military purposes. And so everybody looked forward to the peace dividend. And when President Nixon was in office, he also spoke about the peace dividend. And in fact, there was a peace dividend. The peace dividend isn't understood very well because the word dividend doesn't really describe what's happening. It's more like a tax reduction than it is a dividend. If you think of
A tax reduction to who?
well, if you think of military spending as a tax, which is paid to the Defense Department and defense-related agencies in order to provide the nation with national security. When that amount of spending for national security or military purposes is reduced, it's like a tax reduction. And nobody declares a tax dividend to anybody. Checks don't get sent out to people. But the civilian part of the government has funds available to use for civilian non-military purposes. And that's what we're really getting when defense is reduced by that much.
So right now they claim roughly half of our federal taxes are going to defense. Is that correct? Is that roughly correct?
Well, I'm not sure if that's true. You'd have to really examine the distribution of revenues and what agencies are getting how much. But defense is obviously an enormous part of our government activity and government spending. And by the way, there are claims from the Pentagon and from ardent supporters of military spending that if defense is cut by the amount that people are talking about now, that it will result in reduced jobs of so many people and that the economy will be hurt.
Do you believe that?
Well, no, I don't, and the facts don't support it, because what that assumes, and a lot of people think, that defense spending supports our economy. It's just the other way around. The economy supports defense. If it wasn't for a strong economy, we couldn't have a strong defense program. And as far as jobs goes, there have been analyses that show how many jobs are created by various levels of spending for defense or for non-defense purposes. And the most recent studies show that if you have $1 billion and you spend it for defense purposes, you get something like 11,000 jobs. If you spent the same amount of money for education, you would get more than twice as many jobs, roughly 24,000 jobs. And if you spent it for other civilian purposes, you would get anywhere from 17,000 to 20,000 jobs, versus the 11,000 you get when you spend it for the military. So the fact is, you're not getting jobs by spending for the military, you're losing jobs.
There are 2 points I want to make, and that is, if you're going to cut the defense budget, and the Cold War is over, doesn't it make sense that since we got 20 bases, American bases in Germany, some 50,000 men and women there, why are they there? They're just standing there for what? The Cold War is over. Wouldn't that be a logical point to cut? We've cut a lot of bases here in the States, but we haven't touched the European bases.
It's a mystery to me.
And it wouldn't hurt our economy because they're not hiring that many American people in Germany to take care of those bases. They're hiring a lot of German people.
Yes.
So how would that hurt us? Doesn't that make sense?
It makes sense because usually you station troops abroad for a particular purpose. You're helping that country that faces a threat against a country that also threatens the U.S. So it's in our interest to help that country. Or there are regional instabilities involved, and you want to provide some stabilizing factor, and you think U.S. troops there would provide a stabilizing factor. Now, what is the purpose for having American troops in Germany?
Well, there was, but it's gone. Purpose is gone. The Cold War is over.
The Cold War is
ended.
over. The threats to Germany are over, and there are other troops in Italy and other foreign countries where the same thing will be said.
But they probably wouldn't close them all because we still have a very big military hospital there where everybody goes there first. But do we need to have 20 bases and 50,000? That's the question. I don't think so.
The short answer is no, we don't need it.
Comment, if you would, on the number of bases. Didn't you, Economists for Peace and Security, do a study on bases around the world?
Yes.
Yes.
We found that there were more than, at least the people that did the study, that there were more than 700 U.S. military bases around the world. So it's an enormous number, and obviously it's far more than we need. Just the number tells you that.
Richard, explain who did the study. I'm not sure the viewers know who the Economists for Peace and Security is. You might describe that a little bit.
Economics for Peace and Security is a nonprofit organization. It's composed mainly of university-based economists all around the country. And we have offices in New York, and we have a board of directors and a board of advisors, of whom something like 10 or 12 are Nobel Prize winners. And we have other eminent economists and scholars in our organization. We're not 100% economists. We do have other people in it, but the vast majority are economists. And we do studies of economics that are related to national security, including studying the costs of various programs and the financial implications of investing in defense rather than in our own economy.
And the chair and vice chair of that great organization
Well,
are?
the chairperson of the organization is James Galbraith, who is the son of John Kenneth Galbraith. James is on the economics faculty of the University of Texas, and I happen to be a vice chairman of the board of directors.
The person in the background for our viewers' perspective is Ed. What's your last name?
Helm.
Ed Elm. A lot of us know him as Mark Twain.
Well, let me mention a little story to Mark Twain about the peace dividend.
Okay.
Because when we had our last peace dividend in the 1990s, there were some very beneficial results. Now, it's in the tradition of not really missing something until it's gone, that we now realize how good the peace dividend was by how good the economy was in the 1990s. Defense spending went down.
Jobs went up.
Jobs went up, productivity went up, the federal deficit went down. There were just a lot of major benefits to our economy, and during that period, for the first time in my memory, we even started reducing the national debt, which is a little bit different from deficit.
Under the Clinton administration.
Under the Clinton administration. And the question we really should be asking now is when we start cutting back on defense spending now, which has already started to a very limited extent. But there have been actions that will reduce defense spending over the next 10 years by approximately $400 billion. These cuts were originally instituted by Secretary Gates, who was then the Secretary of Defense, who left about a year ago. Under the law that set up the so-called super committee, which was supposed to come up with a package of spending reductions.
And they came out with zills.
They weren't able to agree on anything, but under the law that created them, if they failed to come up with a package, failed to agree to a package, then there would be some automatic cuts. And the automatic cuts would be divided among the civilian and military agencies of the government, including the Department of Defense. When those cuts go into effect, which they are now scheduled to do,
2013, I hear. Is that correct?
January of 2013, there will be additional substantial cuts to the defense budget, which will make the total cuts over the next 10 years amount to $1 trillion.
Is that about the 30% range?
No, it's not.
It's not.
And it sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, obviously. But the defense program has grown so large, so fast,
Out of control.
in the past 10 years, that the cut of $1 trillion over the next 10 years will amount to $200 billion a year, or around 15%. So the total cut and the total peace dividend at this point would amount to only 15% versus 30% after Vietnam and 30% when the Cold War ended. And the question now is, can we really supplement those savings by additional defense reductions to come up with at least a 30% reduction over time?
Well, cutting bases in Germany, that would be a big help.
It would be a big help, but we need a lot more help than
Oh.
that.
Didn't we just mention earlier that there's roughly 700 bases in Europe?
Yes.
Or around the world?
Around the world. Right.
So Germany's not the only country where they have too many American bases that we don't need, I'm sure. That's just one good example.
Absolutely. And by the way, when Robert Gates was ready to retire from his position as Secretary of Defense, it was just earlier this year, he was interviewed by the New York Times. And he said something very intriguing in that interview. He said that in the future, we should only engage in wars of necessity rather than wars of choice. And that is only when our vital interests were being threatened should we engage in a war. That's a war of necessity. When our vital interests are not being threatened,